Today I'm going to be talking about exposure therapy, the number one most effective way to overcome anxiety. We're going to be talking about what it is, what makes it so incredibly effective against anxiety, and how to do it. Hi everyone. In today's video, we're going to be discussing exposure therapy, the gold standard number one tool to overcome anxiety. And although it can seem simple, it's important to understand what exposure therapy is and where it comes from. But before I get into that, just a couple of disclaimers to go over. I'm a registered psychologist in the province of British Columbia, Canada, and this video is for informational purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute or replacement for advice from your doctor or mental health professional. Now, with those things out of the way, let's start talking about exposure therapy. Now, the internet is filled with do this simple hack to stop anxiety, or 3 simple steps to eliminate anxiety right now. The problem is none of this stuff works, because if it did, no one would ever experience anxiety. What we know is that exposure therapy and exposure is the best way to overcome anxiety, and it's been around for decades. It still works, and it still works great. Now, in order to understand how exposure works, you need to understand how anxiety works and what keeps anxiety going, because once you have this understanding of how anxiety works, it makes a lot more sense as to why exposure therapy is so effective. Now, the thing is, anxiety is an emotional response to a feared trigger situation or trigger event. So in specific phobias, it can be things like spiders, heights, needles, even driving. Social anxiety, it's social situations. In generalized anxiety disorder, it's uncertainty. In panic disorder, it's physical sensations. So these are all the feared stimuli, the feared situations, the feared objects that cause a person a great deal of anxiety and distress. And so when a person encounters the feared object, what happens? Well, their anxiety increases. And this is really uncomfortable. It doesn't feel good, so it's natural to want to eliminate that feeling. And the quickest and seemingly easiest way to do this is to escape or avoid that situation or object. But the problem is, well, the upside is that avoidance makes the anxiety go away, which makes you feel good. So avoidance, it's sort of a problem, but it isn't, because avoidance is the quickest way to eliminate anxiety. So that seems like a pretty good solution, right? If avoidance eliminates my anxiety quickly, maybe I just need to engage in more avoidance. The problem is, as you can probably guess, is that avoidance limits a person's life. So I maybe won't get together with people. It limits what types of jobs I can have. It limits where I can go. It limits what I can do. This avoidance makes my world a lot smaller. The second problem with avoidance is it also keeps the anxiety going, because the next time I come into contact with that trigger situation or trigger object, what do I have to do? I have to avoid it. And so this avoidance becomes self-perpetuating, and it drives the anxiety, which becomes self-perpetuating. So what happens is, the more I avoid, is that it keeps reinforcing my beliefs that the trigger or the object is dangerous, and that something bad will happen, and that I'm unable to cope. And so this is how it keeps driving my anxiety. So avoidance, in essence, is short-term gain in exchange for long-term suffering. So this is where exposure comes in. Rather than avoiding, exposure is all about coming into contact with the feared situation and seeing what will happen. Seeing if something bad will happen, seeing how I will respond when I come into contact with that situation. So think about what happens if I'm engaging in exposure. I come into contact with the trigger situation, the trigger object, and I force myself to stay in the situation. What's going to happen to my anxiety? Well, my anxiety is going to go up. But the thing is, my anxiety can't go up forever and ever and ever until my head pops off. Eventually, the anxiety is going to plateau. And if I give it enough time, eventually it'll go down by itself. So in essence, the alarm goes off, but the alarm then shuts off when I start to recognize and start to realize that nothing bad is happening. So the idea is I repeat the exposures over and over again over time, and as I do this, what happens is the intensity of the anxiety decreases, and the time needed for the anxiety to go away decreases. So exposure is really difficult in the short term. You have to tolerate a lot of distress. You have to tolerate a lot of anxiety. It certainly isn't quick and easy. But in the long term, it's a really sustainable and permanent solution to make the anxiety go away. So whereas avoidance is short-term gain for long-term sort of suffering and pain, exposure is about short-term pain and distress for long-term benefit. So the question is, how do you go about doing exposure? How do you go about doing exposure properly? The key is, one thing people will sometimes do is say, okay, if I need to do exposure, I'll just jump in and do exposure to the scariest thing and just face my fears. So if I have a fear of spiders, I'm going to go hold a tarantula. The problem with this is something we call flooding. And flooding can make anxiety a lot worse. What happens in these types of situations is that it makes the anxiety so high that my anxiety, when I come into this high anxiety provoking situation, my anxiety gets so high that I can't take it anymore. I can't tolerate that level of anxiety. And so I stop the exposure early. And so what happens is my anxiety comes down really quickly because I've avoided and I've escaped the situation. But what it does is it reinforces that avoidance and it reinforces that belief that I can't cope. So this flooding has actually made the situation worse for the next time I come into contact with that feared situation. So flooding, while on the surface may seem like, hey, this will be the quickest way of getting over it, it doesn't really work and actually can make the anxiety worse. So in exposure therapy, in sort of effective exposure, the step is to come up with a fear hierarchy or an exposure ladder. And the idea with this is to rate exposures from a scale of 0 to 100, starting with smaller exposure numbers and working your way up to harder exposure numbers. So for example, if I have a phobia of dogs, my exposure hierarchy may look something like this. It may start with reading about breeds of dogs, then maybe doing a Google picture search of friendly dogs, then doing a Google picture search of just dogs, then maybe watching videos of puppies on YouTube, then videos of dogs in general, then maybe going to a dog park and watching dogs from inside my car, then maybe walking next to a dog park, then walking inside a dog park, then approaching a small dog on a leash, then a large dog on a leash, then petting a small dog, then petting a large dog. And then maybe at the very top of my hierarchy is watching a movie like Cujo, which involves a really vicious dog. And so what I've done is I've taken all of the potential ways in which I can have some exposure to dogs, and I've rank ordered them from some of the easiest to some of the hardest exposures. And so once I have my exposure ladder, the idea is to start with doing exposure to the lowest anxiety items. And doing exposure to them, staying in the situation until my anxiety comes down. So if I start by reading about different breeds of dogs, I may feel anxious, but the idea is to continue reading about them until I notice my anxiety has reduced significantly. And then the idea is to repeat this exposure multiple times over the course of days or even weeks until the anxiety is minimal, until I can be reading about breeds of dogs and it doesn't cause a whole lot of anxiety for me. Then what I do is I move on to the next item up on the exposure hierarchy or the exposure ladder, and I do the same process again. So I engage in that exposure over and over again multiple times until I notice that it's not causing me a lot of distress, and then I move on to the next one. So at first, when I introduce this idea to my clients, they sometimes can look discouraged or sometimes can look upset, because at first it may seem like this is going to take a really long time. This is going to take forever. But the thing is, the process accelerates as you move up the ladder. What happens as you do these exposures is that you learn that what you're afraid of isn't happening, and you learn that you're able to cope a lot better than you thought. And so the first items on the hierarchy may take a while, but once you start getting those experiences, it gets easier as you go up, even though those are harder exposure items. So with time and practice, you overcome your anxiety, and what this does is it gives you a lot more freedom to be able to live the life that you want, a lot more freedom to be able to do things that you may have never imagined that you'd be able to do. So, although this process of exposure seems straightforward, it's not easy. It requires effort, it requires work, it requires you to tolerate distress. But like with anything meaningful in life, there's no simple shortcut. Yes, exposure therapy is difficult, but the key is it works. So I hope that makes sense. I would love to hear some of your thoughts and ideas about this. Have you done exposure therapy like this before? If so, please leave me some of your thoughts and comments in the comments section down below. If you've been enjoying my videos and would like to see more, please hit that subscribe button and notification bell, and you'll be alerted every week when I post a new video. So that's all for today's video. As always, thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I will see you in the next one.